Good to see a great crowd here on a Thursday morning in the summer when school has started. If we haven't met, I'm Kevin Roberts. I have the pleasure of serving as the Executive Director of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, the largest public policy group outside Washington, D.C. We happen to think that Austin, Texas is probably more important than Washington. We think that every state capital is more important than Washington. But we're very grateful for our guests here, whom I'll introduce momentarily. I just want to take a moment to thank those of you who have joined us via live stream. We know that this will be a very well-watched event, as it should, for the following reason. For decades, the United States of America has failed to solve its immigration problem to the point that it is now a crisis. And what a pleasure it is at the Texas Public Policy Foundation to focus not on the important and necessary work of politics, that's not our domain, but on the important and necessary work of policy. And the two gentlemen with us here today have been role models in how we ought to focus on the substance of the issue. So it's a real pleasure to introduce Congressman Roger Williams and Director Ken Cuccinelli. Director Cuccinelli, as you probably know, was once the Attorney General of the great Commonwealth of Virginia. He is a mechanical engineer by training, went to the University of Virginia, which pains me slightly to say, being a historian trained partially at Virginia Tech Director, but we've gone through that before. He earned his law degree at George Mason and has spent a lot of time in his policy and political career not being afraid of the hard issues, whether that was human trafficking when you were Attorney General or now as the acting director of your agency, sir, focusing on helping America solve this crisis finally. We're also always happy to have our Congressman, Roger Williams, here. Being a baseball fan, although not a TCU fan, Congressman, I, of course, am grateful for the fact that you captained the congressional baseball team. You, of course, had a distinguished career at Texas Christian University, which I understand plays football too, against the Longhorns.
The last 4 years we've done pretty good.
And that, I told you there might be one softball question today, and that was it. I don't know how I recovered from that, Congressman. All kidding aside, if you look at the map of Texas's 30-something congressional districts, you will be impressed by Congressman Williams' district because it ranges appropriately, given your alma mater in Tarrant County, from North Texas all the way down into the western side of Austin. It is, thankfully, one of the most beautiful stretches of country, not just here in Texas, but in the entire United States. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us. For our audience, the way we will proceed today is that each of our guests will have several minutes to make some remarks. I've invited them to make whatever remarks they would like. And then following that, we'll have a series of questions and answers, which I will guide. And then the three of us are very much looking forward to the questions that you will have. I'll cue you when that time comes. Would you please join me in welcoming Congressman Williams and Director Cuccinelli. Director?
Well, good morning to all of you. It's good to be with you. Beautiful facility here. And it is nice to be with a think tank outside of Washington, D.C. And it's been my pleasure to work with TPPF in the past, particularly on criminal justice reform, an area that I have spent many, many years on. And frankly, the more enjoyable work in that front was in state capitals. We were very successful at the federal level eventually, but it is the states where all those lessons are being learned. And in fact, one of the roles I have fallen into as a former Attorney General was with some of the Central American governments. We had a meeting with Secretary McElwain and his equivalents at 5 of those countries, and the subject of prison standards came up. Well, they don't have any, and literally. And so the Secretary leaned back and said, well, Cuccinelli knows about this stuff, and so I got volunteered. And when you start from zero, it's not too hard to get over that bar. Even I can do it. And but you know, some of those areas that TPPF has worked are still live, and they matter not just around America, but now we're getting to use some of those learning opportunities around the world. And if we benefit them, that benefits us, is my view of it. So, but my normal job as the acting director of USCIS, Citizenship and Immigration Services, one of the 3 immigration agencies from the INS breakup, years ago, is not just working the immigration issue, but also communicating on it. So I'm very pleased to be here with the Congressman again. Anybody who's ever spent time in Virginia gets extra points for me, so which he did, and in a part where most of the people in Virginia don't know where it was, so in Withville, Virginia. But I was brought in by President Trump, and he has been, as you all know, very aggressive on the immigration issue. He's doing things and using tactics that none of his predecessors were willing to use, Republican or Democrat. And lo and behold, many of them are working. I would say that we do need more help from Congress. Really, they have not assumed their responsibility. We see the majority in the House right now that holds show hearings, as the Congressman's familiar with, and doesn't advance any meaningful legislation to address the problems that we face. President Trump, on the other hand, has made it very clear to those of us in the administration that we should use every legal tool at our disposal, and we are doing that. So yesterday, you saw the announcement of the Flores rule out of ICE, that is primarily in their bailiwick, related to the detaining of families together beyond 20 days, which has been a major catalyst starting in 2015 for the crisis we face today. Both President Obama and President Trump, I will say, opposed that situation. It came out of a court, shockingly, and and yet Congress wouldn't act, even though President Obama and President Trump were not in different positions on that. Other things that you've seen are MPP, the Remain in Mexico program, alive and well, preparing to expand. This highlights the critical nature of the cooperation with Mexico that's been achieved, frankly, by using the tariffs as a stick. And just for those of you who think about these things, the China tariffs are relevant here. And the reason they're relevant is because the president imposed them. And lots of leaders around the world threaten these things and never impose them. And if any of you have had a 2-year-old, you know the results of that. Nations are just conglomerations of people, and we act like people. And so the president's willingness in other foreign relations arrangements to actually use the sticks, not just the carrots, has been absolutely critical to our success in obtaining help and support from Mexico. And having said that, I do need to give them their credit. They really have taken extraordinary steps in 2019 that have been very, very helpful. A rule that we put out, the IFR, Interim Final Rule, is what IFR stands for. It went into immediate effect. The reason it could go into immediate effect is because it dealt with national security and foreign relations. So we don't have to wait 30 or 60 days from the finalization of the rule. This is the rule that requires people seeking asylum at our southern border to have first sought it and have been rejected at a country through which they have passed. Now, since Mexicans don't pass through any other country, it doesn't apply to them, but it applies to everyone else. And the Ninth Circuit, a judge in the Ninth Circuit nationally enjoined it, and the Ninth Circuit itself undid that outside the Ninth Circuit. So we now have the interesting situation where that rule applies in Texas and New Mexico, but not Arizona and California for now. And fake asylees have swamped our system. It is important to remember there are legitimate asylees coming across that border, people who fit the traditional American offer of help. The most generous nation in the history of the world. There are people genuinely persecuted for their politics, their religion, etc., in their home countries. They are made to wait by people who are lying and cheating in this process. It's important to remember that. We cannot separate the wheat from the chaff without digging into the whole effort. And sort of coming to a theater near you is the unfolding optimism with respect to Guatemala. and they just had an election, which is going to make that a little more difficult. Nonetheless, we do have tools to work with, and if we can get an asylum cooperation agreement, is the proper term, not safe third country agreement, an asylum cooperation agreement in place with Guatemala, that is going to be an enormous addition to the MPP style deterrence at the border. These are all things going on now. My favorite headline so far, and I really don't read much of the news, but was, I forget which of the Washington rags put it out. It's their daily email. Well, it sure is a boring August. Wait, what? And because every week in August, we have been rolling out, we being the administration, have been rolling out new undertakings. I mentioned the IFR yesterday, the Flores rule, public charge last week from my agency, which addresses self-sufficiency, long-held American traditional element of our immigration law that has not been effectively implemented in a number of years. So it's been a very robust August in terms of new policies that can have a real meaningful impact, both short-term and long-term, on American immigration. I would note, since I was at the border most of this week, you all in Texas have a different perspective. I always keep in mind the border towns like Laredo. I was in El Paso in June and so forth. They have meaningful relationships across that international boundary, and it's important to them, both economically, personally, professionally, to keep those accessible and alive. And it's one of the challenges more unique to you all as a border state. And that's something that I take very seriously. The Laredo sector's numbers on commercial activity are amazing. At the same time, one sector over in the Rio Grande Valley, their numbers on illegals are amazing, and both right next to each other. And we have to contend with both. Things are not the same in each place. These folks on the front lines do not get credit for the thousands of rescues they do, for the humanitarian work they have been doing, particularly in the last year. They get dumped on by people who could solve the problem and choose to complain and, in some cases, make up stories, just lie publicly to their detriment and reputationally. And these are good law enforcement folks. They're professionals. They care about the people they're encountering. They treat them with dignity even when they're breaking the law. And they do it in a way as best they can to keep themselves and their fellow Americans, us, safe. And it's worth our appreciation. We do need Congress to act. It's always awkward in a 535-person branch of the government to sit with one of them and act like they're all equally at fault, because they're not. And I'm sure the congressman will lay that out in more detail. But the reality is we've seen nothing but inaction. It took a half a year to convince many people there was a crisis just to get enough money to deal with the children in June. And if you saw what happened in 1 month, we solved the detention overcrowding aspect of that. When they finally doggone took the advice of the experts, we actually solved the problem. Well, hey, I got a great idea. Why don't we take the advice of the experts on the rest of the problem? And with that, I will turn it back over. Thank you.
That was not a softball, Director. Well said. Thanks so much. Congressman, you have been cued very well. So the floor is yours, and when you're done, I'll have some questions.
Does anybody have any questions? Right. Director, thank you for being here. We travel the country, not together, but off and on. We always see each other in the green rooms, don't we? You're doing a great job. We appreciate you. I want to thank the foundation for what they do and so forth.
You're welcome. Thank you.
It's a real honor to be here. And when I ran for Congress back in 2012, I mean, I'm just a business guy. I own businesses and so forth, and I believe in legal immigration, like we all do. But when I ran for Congress, part of my platform was lower taxes, less government, cut spending, and defend borders. And as many of you know, I was Secretary of State under Governor Perry. I see some of my colleagues sitting around. And I spent a lot of time at the border back in 05, 06, 07, seeing what was going on. So I kind of have a background on that. But I do believe, we're talking about Congress, and it's what it is basically. It's the freebies versus the rule of law. I mean, that's what we have going on right now between both parties. But, sovereignty is important. Securing our borders is important, or most important, and we got to address this. I'm glad President Trump is doing this because it's a real challenge for our country. But I go down there quite a bit. And last time I was down there was a couple of months ago, and I went into a building that was supposed to hold about 1,500. 3,500 were in that building when I was there. And our Border Patrol, as you said, we need to pray for these people every single day. They are overwhelmed with what they're doing, and they're asked to do things they weren't trained to do. But we got 3,500 now in this building, and there's 2 doors in it, and one door is a lot of people going out. And these are the ones that have got their court date. And they're going to come back in 5 years, right? 10% of those come back in 5 years, and when they do come back, they ask for a change of venue so they can hang out another 5 years. Then they got the door over here, and that's the door where the Border Patrol's bringing the ones in they've rescued. And, the idea that some of these people say they're in cages and they're not being trained or not being treated right, just go down there. Look at the volunteerism from the McAllen community. They're folding clothes, they're washing clothes. 3 meals a day, a shower. And it's the idea of it's a homemade crisis, a made-up crisis. We're not treating people right. It's just a pure lie. We're doing everything we can do to help these folks. But at the same time, we've got to get back to defending our borders and the rule of law. And I remember I had a meeting with some law enforcement in my district just a couple of weeks ago. And they brought up to me, they said, Congressman, here's a fact for you. We're all familiar with Interstate 35, naturally. Well, 50% of the DUIs on Interstate 35 are from illegals. 90% of the 50% have absolutely no identification. So you give them a ticket, and you can't put them in jail because the jails are full here, Director. So you send them along their way. And one officer told me that he had arrested one guy 5 times and had to release him. 5 times. And one night at 2 o'clock in the morning, he got a call, and there was a head-on collision on Interstate 35. It killed some people. He went out there, and the only person who was still alive was a guy he arrested 5 times. So these are the stories you get because of illegal immigration. And it's got to be fixed. We've got a small community in my district, small town, that has about 100 people in there. They don't know where they came from, and they're just moving around. And so this is the problem that we have. And we've got to address it, and we want to help people. See, I want everybody to realize the American dream. Everybody should realize the American dream, but they should do it legally. That's all. We got laws to make it happen. And that's why I think it's important we show folks that got to go to the ports of entry, not between, so they can understand what is required to realize the American dream. Because throwing rocks at Border Patrol and burning flags is no way to enter the country, in my mind. And so, I made a few notes here just from hanging out in Washington, having this debate. But, there's no reason to reward bad behavior. And that's what we do here. Every one of you, if you run a traffic light or you do something, you're going to go to jail. But here, if you're illegal, you don't go to jail. You get rewarded. When did we start that program? And I've been called a pretty hard liner, but when I went into office, I raised my hand and sort of uphold the Constitution and the land of the law. And that's how I think all we need to be doing. But Ben Carson comes to our hearings a lot, and he brought up an interesting fact that the illegals are just taking up all the needed housing, the low income housing, and from Americans. We can't find homes for our citizens because the illegals are filling up all our interim housing. It's things like that. But I've always talked about, Director, I think we need about 5,000 more Border Patrol down there. I think we need 300 judges to help process these folks. We don't have that. I'm a boots on the ground guy, but those are the kind of things we need to be talking about. No amnesty. I mean, we've already got a pathway to citizenship. Why give anybody anything free for breaking the law? The idea that we are a land of laws, I think, is important. And so, as somebody representing the United States Congress, and I went to TCU, as you said, so I got to keep it simple, as they say. But I want to cast votes for the rule of law. That's pretty easy, and we can fix this thing. But we have to have support from everybody that understands we don't dislike people wanting to come to America. A lot of those people have built this great country. But do it legally. It's about as simple as you get. Don't break the law, and we'll help you realize the dream. And that's kind of where I stand. If that's hard line, I guess it is. But I want to fix the problem. We do have a problem with Congress on both sides, frankly. Nobody, in many cases, want to address it. We do a lot of talking up in Congress, but we do no action. And I'm one of some that is trying to make something happen. And we'll see what happens when we get back and see if we can just support the rule of law and make it happen.
Thanks, Congressman, for your comments, for your leadership on this issue and others. And the first question I'll direct your way because you touched on it in the last thing you said. If I were to take a step back and just provide a very quick summary, I think for people in the grassroots, for people here who have jobs that are different than yours and the directors, but spend time thinking about the news and are genuinely worried about the humans involved in this, whether they be the Border Patrol officers or the people who are crossing the border illegally, ultimately for them, it boils down to respecting the rule of law. Right. And the failure of this country, which is distinguished historically by adhering to that rule of law, to have a clear and just system has cost people their lives. I mean, that's not hyperbole to say. And these folks who have this very common sense perspective then say, what in the world will change in Congress for there to be sufficient incentive for members of Congress to actually fix this problem?
It's a great question. Well, first of all, you got to realize there is a problem. And then you got to get through the fact that just because your guy's not president doesn't mean you quit adhering to the law. I mean, I was not an Obama supporter, but I also tried to adhere to the law, and he was my president. True. And that's the biggest problem. Until we realize there's an issue, and you've got to go down there to see it, and it's not a made-up crisis, then it's not going to be affected. But I think people are beginning to see now that it is an issue. So we've got to get it to where it is an issue, and people can get the dislike for this president. Candidly, I'm speaking. Get the dislike for this president, and don't say, well, if we do something that helps the border, then he gets a win. Well, no, he doesn't get a win. America gets a win. And these people are trying to get in the border illegally that want to realize the dream, that we're losing children, we're losing moms and dads. They are the winners. That's who we want to help. But I just don't understand why we've all of a sudden accepted the fact and the love fest for illegal people that want to break the law when we got homeless veterans out there we're ignoring. So that's going down another path. But until we realize it's a problem, until we realize we're not giving the president a win, we're giving America and the world a win by having legal immigration, I don't know when it's going to get started.
Okay. That I'm sure will be one of our themes in Q&A, so I know I'm going to come back to that question. I appreciate the answer very much and agree with you largely. I want to pitch a question to you, Director, regarding something that was in the news yesterday. There's a very important announcement about ending the Flores settlement agreement. I'd like for you, if you don't mind, to do a couple of things for sort of generalists in the audience who aren't real experts on that issue. What's the significance of that? And then secondly, for those of us, especially with TPPF's Right on Immigration project, who spend some time thinking about it, look into your crystal ball and predict for us what the impact of that decision will be.
So Flores refers to a case name that was settled in 1997 in, shockingly, California, where you all are apparently causing a great deal of homelessness.
We do what we can,
Director.
Director.
Feel terrible. It could have nothing to do with years and years of liberal policies. But speaking of going down another path, Congressman, but
that's a good path for us.
I knew the two of you would be trouble.
In 1997, a settlement was entered into to address actually unaccompanied children and how they would be cared for. And detention time of 20 days was part of that arrangement. Fast forward 18 years to 2015 under the Obama administration, and that settlement by that judge was expanded to cover families. The Obama administration objected to this. They didn't support this because they knew what a disaster it was. Now, if you go back and look at the graphs, the data, you will see a spike that started with that expansion of the settlement right there. Because suddenly, children became the ticket in. And we began two things. One, just they became a ticket in. Two, they started to get trafficked in very significant numbers and recycled. And that continues to be an underappreciated tragedy of the crisis at the border. The significance of the Flores regulation yesterday is that it removed the 20-day limitation on detention for families. They can now be held legally until their court dates. Now, there's a facilities challenge. As luck would have it, I was at Dilley yesterday on the same day, which is ICE's largest family detention facility, and where they do a spectacular job. Just as the Congressman said, CBP puts themselves on the line, does a great job. ICE does too, and they seem to be the left's greatest, hate post to go after them. And so the critical nature of this is that we can now hold families more than 20 days. And so when you're back in your home neighborhood in pick a country, Honduras, you now know you can't just come up with the kids and assume after 20 days you're going to be released. That assumption is gone as of yesterday. That's the significance. It is a tremendous deterrent. But two, the law actually says we're supposed to hold apprehended illegals until their hearings happen. There's no law that says we're supposed to release people. There's no law that says catch and release should happen. There is a law that says detention is supposed to happen for the entire duration of that person's illegal stay. So, why we didn't just say, well, sorry, we're out of room. If you follow that law, then the limiting factor on illegal immigration becomes how many beds ICE has in the 50,000 range. And, of course, that is not the path that either Republican or Democrat administrations went down. And so we've now established custom and tradition and reliance, as the courts would call it, that doesn't give us the opportunity to go that way. So here we have taken out one of the major catalysts to the crisis at the border is this Flores settlement. It will come into effect gradually, meaning real-world effect. The rules announced yesterday. So, but the meaningful impact will work its way into the system as time goes on. And ICE is now going to have to shift their detention facilities to hold more families. And I firmly believe that until those families start showing back up in the neighborhoods they left, that is when we will start to see major long-term drops in departures from Central America illegally coming to this country.
Thanks, Director. Congressman Williams, considering that context, I have a question for you as a member of Congress about your own crystal ball. Looking ahead the next year and a half, obviously we're in a campaign season, particularly thinking about the rhetoric at the level of the presidential race, not all of which is helpful. My question is there really hope for Congress in a bipartisan way to get something done to fix this problem?
Full disclosure, I'm an optimist, okay? The glass is always half full when I look at it. But we are in election year. The rhetoric is hot. It's at a higher level, and it's going to get higher every single day. And so I think if I look in my crystal ball, what's going to happen, I think it's going to continue to be a fist fight. It's going to continue to be a war of words. I don't know if anything will happen because we are in election year. And I get back to the one fact, we have a president. Whether you voted for him or not, he's our president. And until the other side and the people that are not support him feel like they can do something without him getting credit for it, I don't know if we're going to have anything happen. It's not about the credit game. The big picture is, like I said earlier, the credit, the whatever you want to call it, the world gets better when we have immigration reform and we become the land of the law again. So it's a campaign like many of us have never seen before from an anger standpoint, from a verbal standpoint. So I'm not confident that much will get done between now and then unless the president and the director can get it done without Congress. And I hope that changes. We're going to be fighting for it, but at the same time, we've got that issue.
Yeah, if I could just comment on a TPPF arena, the criminal justice reform. One of the major impediments to actually getting over the finish line was people who had for years wanted criminal justice reform to happen, but as the congressman said, suddenly didn't want it to happen because they didn't want this president to get credit for it. Now that didn't rule the day, thankfully, and we got a good bill that is going to make America's criminal justice system work better. But it had to be done by overcoming that attitude. It is a major impediment. And let's not forget, to be bipartisan in our criticism. I mean, when Paul Ryan was the speaker, Paul Ryan submarined the best opportunity we had legislatively when Bob Goodlatte's bill, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, came through. And not enough people will challenge their own leadership in the GOP to beat them down when they are wrong. And we had leadership there that defended the status quo, they were the Chamber of Commerce Congress. They wanted illegal immigration, and this is not just left and right. There's plenty of people who are often associated with the right, although I don't know why the Chamber of Commerce is. I like the NFIB sticker on the back of the phone here. Get the small businesses. They actually make better representatives. But these problems have been bipartisan, and I agree with the congressman about the nature of the rhetoric and how many people on the left view not wanting this president to succeed. But on substance, that isn't the only place there's a problem. I actually think the 2020 election can help solve that problem. I believe when you run on things and people know this is what I get if I vote for X, if this party becomes the majority, I get this bill. Look at what the president did with the Scalia Supreme Court seat. He actually put a list of judges out and added later to that, but they were all in the mold of that list. And we knew what we were getting. And the other side was afraid to put out the judges they would nominate because they scare people. And when the American people get to make that choice, I think it has a real meaningful impact on the actual policy. It's a good example of good politics and good policy coinciding.
And let me just add to that. I mean, you brought up the Goodlatte bill. I mean, that was going to fix a lot of things.
Yep.
And I think we had, if I remember, we had about 198 votes for it.
Yep.
Just with the first whip when you needed 218, but we never could.
Well, and the leadership didn't help with the whipping.
Right.
operation.
They kept wanting to sell a one that only had about 98 people voting for it. But that's passed. We got to look forward, and we got to keep coming up with good legislation. We got to promote, and we got to sell.
Right.
And elections have consequences.
So thank you both for that exchange. I think it's really helpful for our audience, both here and folks who've joined via live stream. I have a question for both of you now, and it's a question about a potential inflection point. The Supreme Court has agreed to hear a case that could, if it's ruled one way, dramatically affect DACA. And that could come in the spring. Let's just tease that out a little bit and look at both scenarios where DACA is really damaged or it's upheld. And how does that play out, particularly in a policy way? I'm thinking, Congressman, about potential for congressional action, but we cannot escape the fact that it's 2020 and not just an election year, but a presidential election year. Congressman, let's start with you.
Well, the DACA debate's been going on a while. If you remember, President Trump offered a much wider DACA program to the Democrats to get their support and still couldn't get it. I think he doubled the number of DACA folks that could come here, but it still didn't get any footage. And that's an example of what I'm talking about. Just what can you do? But DACA is a really emotional. It's a really emotional issue when you have a lot of these kids that, frankly, have been very successful and they do good things. But at the same time, I go back to again the law. What's the law say? The Supreme Court's going to be looking at some issues. We don't know how they're going to rule. That will change the whole debate on which way they go. But I think there again, if you just can't have a steady stream of people coming over here that did it wrong. And, so there's a point in thing, you got to make a decision. What are your guidelines in making the decision? And mine are, they broke the law, so how do we uphold the law, or how do we change the law to make it work? And I have a big heart for a lot of these folks. In fact, I actually know a few good people, but at the end of the day, this United States of America, land of law, let's address the law or let's change the law. We'll see what the Supreme Court says.
Thank you. Director?
Yeah, I fully expect DACA to be knocked down. You have a great Attorney General here in Ken Paxton, and a number of years ago, he brought the parallel case, the DAPA case, same legal basis. And the Fifth Circuit ruled that that was illegal and shut it down. And then it went up to the Supreme Court, and it had a 4-4 tie. This is after Justice Scalia had passed away. And so the Fifth Circuit's ruling stood. Tie does not go to the runner in court cases, only in baseball. And so that's gone. And I expect the same legal basis to be relied upon by the Supreme Court. It'll probably be 5-4, but not because it's really a close question. I think the outcome of this is not really very much in doubt, and it won't take till the spring. I expect to see a ruling the end of January or early February, and the president has made it clear that he, in the past, has had a willingness to negotiate. But if those who want to, congressionally address DACA want to do so at this point, the president's in a lot stronger position, and they should get a lot less for that. Now, I don't speak for the president on that, but I'm relying on what I saw in the episode the Congressman was referring to, and that you could see that coming again. I don't know how the fact that 2020 is an election year will affect that, but I do think it is an emotional issue itself. You'll see people on camera say, "Hey, I'm one of these people. Why should this apply to me?" And it's because the law applies to you. And a lot of those folks complain to us, and the people, if they want solutions, then they need to go to the congressmen who support making that change, the congresswomen, speaker, who support making that change. And they're going to have to actually come to the table instead of just spouting hot air in Congress. And I'm referring to the folks who want this amnesty. And they're going to have to come to the table and actually negotiate in a meaningful way, not what happened last time we saw this.
Well, and just real quick, going back in history like we talked about, if you remember, I think the number that the Democrats wanted for DACA, you had to, if you were here between certain dates, it was 700,000.
Right.
And the president gave the State of the Union address, said, "I'll give you 1,700,000. And they still wouldn't go for it, because it would have been perceived, I believe, as a victory for him, trying to make a deal, trying to come up with the right issues. So now, like you say, it's a different ballgame.
Yeah, they wanted the political stick.
Right.
They didn't want a solution.
That's remarkable. I've never heard of that in history.
New concept.
It is. Neither of you knows about that. One more question for me, and then we'll pitch the audience. So if you're sitting in the audience and you have a question, we'll come to you shortly. And Director, this question's for you. I want to take a step back even from the United States and think about the other factors in this immigration problem. And undoubtedly, we know this from our research with Right on Immigration, it has a lot to do with the dysfunction and corruption of Central American elites. And what can the United States do from an immigration policy perspective or foreign policy perspective to change that dynamic?
Well, some of the best tools we have skip the elites entirely. And I'll give you an example in my agency, H-2A visas. These are seasonal agricultural visas, agricultural work, which is, first of all, very important to our agriculture industry here in the United States. We're talking about 200,000 people or so a year. About 180,000 of them come out of Mexico. Most of the rest of the 20,000 come from the Northern Triangle countries. And one of the things that we're talking to Guatemala actively about is implementing what amounts to an accelerated set of opportunities for their citizens to participate in this, because by their standards, this is a significant amount of money. The per capita income in the 3 Northern Triangle countries ranges from about $2,500 to $4,500 a person, per person. That is not much. $300 a month exceeds the bottom level of that. Well, people who get those H-2A opportunities earn a lot more than that. And now at the same time, if Guatemala doesn't cooperate, it is also entirely within the Secretary's discretion to completely take them off what's called the white list. You've heard of blacklists. This is a white list. So all these nations are on there and eligible to freely participate instead of having a case-by-case arrangement, which is much more cumbersome and frankly leads to less people in your country participating. That's also an option for us. So there's a carrot there and there is a stick there. And we bypass the government entirely. Having said that, I want to make one comment about one of the governments down there. El Salvador has a new president who I have been very impressed with. He has immediately gone after MS-13, has immediately gone to shut down prison enterprises. I say prison enterprises, criminal enterprises operating out of the prisons. MS-13 operates out of their prisons quite freely. Well, they're blocking cell signals there. Not complicated, shuts down the business. They don't have a T1 line. They use cell phones. And there's many reasons this is important. One, this is a president who has said, look, this is our problem to solve. And that shows me an element of pride in his own country that I respect and appreciate seeing. He has said publicly, this is our problem to solve, meaning their piece of it. It's also important because there are people in his country and ours who have said, oh, you know, it's hopeless to go after these gangs. You can't expect these people, meaning perfectly respectable individuals who've gotten the support of their fellow countrymen, won elections, and are willing to bring policy, frankly, hammers to bear. He's proven it can be done. He did it immediately. Immediately. So when we hear people in our country and theirs say, oh, X can't be done or Y can't be done, whether it's Mexican cartels or MS-13 or 18th Street out of Honduras, there's a whole variety of gangs that we have to contend with. It can be done. It can be done. And so there are partners down there that offer optimism. It is important, in my view, part of what I've done with the prison work is try to respect them. You know, their country isn't as far along as ours is, but they're human beings and they care about their country too. And if we deal with them, I think, on that level of respect, I think that we are in a better position to help them. It would be nice to see some of the businesses that seem to think that social engineering is part of their corporate calling. Well, go open a factory down there. They're willing to work. They'll do the work. And there are safe parts of these countries. And there are many safe parts of these countries. I mean, there are places in our country you wouldn't go, right? So there's no completely safe country. But there are ways we can engage here that are very positive, that are not us dictating to them, that respect people like President Bukele, who is the new president of El Salvador's intent to try to attack this problem their way. And whatever their way is, we need to respect that to a certain degree, and I think help them along as best we can.
Can I just add one thing?
Yes, sir.
To what you said, and I think it's important, and as from a business standpoint, I think one of the things we can do, and you touched on, is we can help these people create an economy. Yes. You know, we can put plants down there. We can do these kind of things to help them create an economy. Then they don't need to have the issue we've got. They can come up here on vacation, you see? But that's a big thing we can do with the economy we got and the opportunities we have. We could help them create an economy down there as much as anything, and I think slow it down.
Well, thank you both for those responses. Now we'll turn to the audience, and I'll ask you to do a couple of things. Number one, wait for the recognition that the question's yours, wait for the mic. But then secondly, just keep your question brief so that we can get through as many questions as possible, because we are going to keep this on a really tight timeline. Ma'am? Yes, ma'am.
Adriana Dean. Thank you so much for the question that you did on regards to rhetoric. Now, Director Cuccinelli can, since I know you for 10 years, Congressman Roger Williams. Roger, because I know you for 13 years. Both of you have been so good communicating with the Hispanic community. Ken just did an interview in Univision, and he was recognized by Jorge Ramos as being the only directive who was willing to speak to Univision. He had a wonderful conversation, wonderful program on Sunday. Roger, you have been in my Spanish talk show. But the rhetoric that most of the people hear from the Hispanic community is rhetoric that is harsh, that is hateful, by some of the people in the conservative side. How both of you, or what are you planning to both of you so that stops and that you both can help to promote that they take the same steps that you both have done, communicating with a good semantics, with a calm tone, because both of you are very engaging. And
So Adriana, I've known you for 3 years, and I know that I have to stop you and say, please get to your question.
Yes. So that's the question.
Okay.
I asked the question. The question is,
Sure. Yes, ma'am.
what are you willing to do to help so more people can really engage instead of taking the step that other people say, we don't need to speak with the Spanish-speaking people because they are not important.
Perfect. Thank you. Great question.
So one of the things I've been doing since I arrived, unsuccessfully so far, but I hope we're on the verge of success, is bringing on what amounts to an entire parallel Spanish fluent communications team. And because I agree with you about how important that is. There are certain aspects of the rhetoric that are difficult for me to affect, except our originating speech. I will say also, without backing off, those of you who watch various networks and may see me on one or the other of them, it can be a rough exchange. I do not believe in unilateral disarmament. I'm going to give better than I get, and I'm going to do it with substance and in a way that tries to deliver the actual positive message that President Trump's got to deliver. We need to be more engaged in the actual Spanish-speaking media community, and I can just assure you that while it's been slower than other things I've done, literally from day one I've been looking to build that kind of capacity, because we need to have it. And we need to have it with people who believe in what the president is trying to do in the immigration space. It isn't just, communicators, because even among, there's no wing of politics that completely agrees on this issue. So that is a very important element to me.
Thank you. Congressman, would you like to add anything?
Well, real quick, as you know, I engage in the Hispanic community, and I can't speak for my other colleagues, but the fact of the matter is, I think we as Republicans and conservatives do a much better job. What you're doing is great of getting out there. See, I feel like the Hispanic community majority thinks exactly like most of us do. I mean, they want fairness, family values, limited government, all the kind of things we believe in. But we have a tendency in the Republican Party to not be very good retailers. We don't really go sell our message, and I think there's a huge opportunity for us to sell our message, because the Hispanic community is they're willing to listen. They're willing to listen to us, because the other side in many cases is just beating them down and telling them things that you'll never do this, you'll never do that, which is not true. And I think we need to be better communicators, better retailers to sell the message that we stand for.
Thank you. Couldn't agree more. Next question, right there in the back. Yes, sir.
A very significant portion of the economies of the Central American states, countries are remittances from the U.S. Are we willing to be considering using taxes on those remittances, as a carrot to achieve some of the policies that you want?
So that's not directly in my agency, but I can tell you that, and you've seen publicly, that's not fake, that consideration has been given to that. The mechanics, the logistics of it can be very daunting, but it is an enormous financial element in all of the economies south of the Rio Grande. I mean, it is a big, big deal to every single one of those countries. So putting it on the table itself is step one. And I mentioned the Chinese tariffs. This is a president who's been willing to use the sticks. And he has the capacity to do this. So it is, I'll call it an arrow in the quiver for him. and it is very real.
Thanks for that question. We've got a question here. Yes, sir. Just wait about 10 seconds. The mic's coming your way. Yes, thank you.
Okay. I have a question for you, Director. Two-part question. First deals with not with directly with your agency, and the second one does. First question is on the new Flores rule, the rule that supersedes Flores. Will unaccompanied minors still be required to be released after 20 days? And what other changes to unaccompanied minors does that rule put forth? And then the second question, so that's one. The second question is your agency considering any new kind of visas for non-seasonal and non-agricultural work? For instance, at a meatpacking plant, we saw this big raid in Mississippi. Illegal immigrants were arrested en masse from a meatpacking plant. To my knowledge, there's no visa for that kind of work. Could there be, or should there be?
So starting with Flores, it's definitely very geeky, but we're better than TPPF.
Thank you for that endorsement.
The regulation yesterday also established a federal licensing undertaking to license the facilities that are housing children. One of the challenges has been that from the court's perspective, we were subject to state licensing regulations in the absence of a federal standard. The federal standard in the Supremacy Clause wipes those out, and so that's the position we're now taking. So, and then I'll just use Texas. We're here. Texas has a regulatory authority, but they really didn't know what to do with these facilities. So they never reached, to my knowledge, any final conclusions about any of them. Waivers have been requested, and we being Department of Homeland Security, ICE in this case, didn't know what we could ultimately do. What are they going to let us do? Well, the licensing scheme that's established by the Flores regulation will make it consistent across the country and take that uncertainty out. It also, by the way, takes this out as a weapon for states that are effectively sanctuary states, and would use this regulatory opportunity as a way to effectively shut down what ICE needs to do in this space. The settlement in 2015, the expansion of the settlement in 2015, is where the court actually, I don't want to say invited, but made it clear that regulation could replace the Flores settlement. So we fully expect this to completely replace the whole settlement, address the whole population. And we're also, of course, taking other steps with respect to children. You've undoubtedly heard about the pilot programs with Border Patrol where they're doing DNA testing, they're identifying fake families. In the areas where those have been implemented, it's something like 30% are fake families, which is an extraordinary number of trafficked children, all in just one shot. I mean, we're not talking a few percent, we're talking a third. I mean, anybody who doesn't think that is a human tragedy, I don't know what it would take for you. But I hope that answers your question. That is not, once the licensing is in place for the children, actually the licensing is sort of secondary. I don't expect that to happen. Now, mind you, unaccompanied children don't stay in ICE's custody. Families do. Unaccompanied children go over to HHS, Health and Human Services, and they become responsible for them. And then they place them out there, and not necessarily on that. This was a joint rule, by the way, with HHS. They don't really communicate much in the immigration space. We'll do it for them. But they are governed by this as well. And so the answer is no, they will not be released on that schedule, but they are still placed out with foster families and other things when they are truly unaccompanied. One of the things we're circling back on is where these kids have parents in the country, and realize how this has worked, folks. The federal government has been the final chain in the human trafficking effort. The federal government has been the final link in the human trafficking effort up to this point. People put children in this pipeline, with a certain degree of confidence, they're obviously willing to risk their children, that they will end up with the parents in the end. We are helping them pull this off.
Thank you for great questions and thorough response, Director. Last question will go to the lady there in the middle of the group there. Yes, ma'am. Graham's coming your way. Thank you.
So with President Trump and this administration ramping up jobs throughout the country, and the trajectory is getting so high that we really are at a loss for staff, for job placements. Do you foresee H-2B visas being increased? And is there something, I know they just did some not long ago, but it really wasn't a significant amount. And now with much more, a greater need, I guess, would that be something that's possible for the future? And my second question, which is kind of related, where are these families going to be housed? Because I remember in the previous administration, they had shut down so many military facilities. So I'm assuming that we might as well utilize those for these families. Is that something that is under consideration?
So on the H-2B front, I mean, this is one really for the Congressman, because the expansion you're talking about happened by Congress. They got together, and I believe it was 20,000 was the number, up from 66,000 up to 86,000 for that particular year. And that was a 1-year fix. So any change to those caps would have to come from Congress. So I'll kind of pitch it to the Congressman.
I'm an employer. I employ about 200 people in my business, but the economy's great. And as you know, you touched on it, we have more jobs than people. Who ever thought we'd ever see that? So I've always been supportive of what I call a flexible visa program, to where if you need X amount, you get X amount, and maybe next year it's more, maybe next year it's not so much. But it's a flexible, where everybody's legally paying taxes, et cetera. And I think we do need that, because I don't see anything stopping the economy right now. There's more job startups in America. New businesses are starting than ever before, because we got a tax structure now, and we got various things that are friendly to business with less burdens. So I think we do need to come up with something like that. I'm very supportive of it. I've kind of got a plan, as I call, flexible visa program. But we need workers, and we need them legally. And let's just work, and we'll turn the lights out at night and start the next morning.
Thanks, Congressman, and thank you, ma'am, for those questions. Unfortunately, we're out of time, and I say unfortunately because this has been a fantastic conversation. So to Congressman Williams, Director Cuccinelli, thanks for joining us here at TPPF. Most of all, for those of you in the audience, those of you watching online, this is what we like to do. We like to say that civil discourse does not require unanimity of opinion. It requires that good people get together and talk about important ideas, ask the right questions, and demand the right answers. And I think the more that we do that in the Texas public square and the American public square, the better off we will be. On behalf of all of us at TPPF, Congressman Williams, Director Cuccinelli, y'all are great Americans. We'll make you an honorary Texan, sir. And thank y'all for being here. Please join me in thanking them.